My grandmother's secret recipe has an ingredient that does not appear in any cookbook. And when I discovered what it was, I stopped eating at her house forever. In my family, grandmother's food is religion. Every Sunday, the whole family gathers at her house, and she cooks a banquet that could feed an army. We have been doing this since before I was born. My mother grew up eating on Sundays at that table. My father grew up eating at that table. My uncles, my cousins, everyone. Grandmother Consuelo's table is the center of the family universe. And kitchen is the temple where absolutely no one enters. That is the first rule. No one enters grandmother's kitchen while she cooks. As a little girl, I tried to enter once because I wanted to help her, and she took me out with a gentleness that hid firmness. My love, this kitchen is only for grandmother. You go play with your cousins. Asked her why, and she told me because recipes have secrets, and secrets tell themselves when it is the right time. I was 6 years old, and it seemed like the most magical answer in the world to me. Now I am 26, it seems like the most suspicious answer. Let me start with what made me suspect. 3 months ago, my uncle Raphael fainted in the middle of Sunday lunch. He fell from his chair and hit his head on the floor. They took to the hospital. The doctor said that he had abnormal levels of something in his blood that they could not identify immediately. They ran tests on him for a week, and in the end, it was probably a cumulative reaction to something in his diet. They prescribed treatment and told him to eat clean for a month. My uncle got better. Everyone assumed it was stress or a bad diet during the week, and no one gave it importance. But I kept thinking about it because my uncle Raphael was not the first. 2 years ago, my Aunt Carmen had kidney problems that the doctors could not fully explain. 4 years ago, my father started having chronic headaches that come and go without a clear diagnosis. 6 years ago, my oldest cousin, who is only 32 years old, developed a liver condition that, according to the doctors, was unusual for her age. And my grandmother, Consuelo's husband died 10 years ago from multi-organ failure that the doctors described as progressive deterioration without an identifiable cause. 5 people from the same family with medical problems that the doctors could not completely explain. And they all ate at the same table every Sunday. I am a chemist. I work in a pharmaceutical laboratory, analyzing compounds. My brain is trained to look for patterns and data. And the pattern here was so obvious that I was ashamed not to have seen it earlier. The common factor was the Sunday meal that only grandmother prepared in the kitchen where no one could enter. The idea that my grandmother could be poisoning her own family seemed so absurd to me that I laughed the first time I thought about it. We are talking about a 78-year-old woman who kisses every grandchild on the forehead when they arrive, who keeps the drawings we made for her as children in a cookie tin. She cries every Christmas when she toasts to the family. This woman could not be capable of something like that. But science does not lie, and neither do patterns. The following Sunday, I went to lunch with a plan. I carried in my purse 3 empty test tubes that I took from the laboratory. During the meal, when no one was looking, I took samples from 3 dishes: the broth, which is the main dish every Sunday, the rice, and the sauce. I kept them in my purse, and on Monday, I took them to the laboratory. I told my coworker that they were samples from a personal project, and he did not ask anything else. I spent the week analyzing the 3 dishes with the laboratory equipment. After hours when no one was there, I found that the rice was clean, the sauce was clean, the broth was not. The broth contained something that took me 3 days to identify, because it was not a common poison. It was not arsenic, nor lead, nor mercury, nor anything that would appear on standard tests. It was ochratoxin, a mycotoxin produced by certain fungi. Prolonged exposure over decades causes multi-organ failure. Exactly what happened to my grandfather. Ochratoxin does not get into a broth by accident. Someone has to cultivate the fungus, extract, add the toxin, and add it deliberately. Or someone has to be using an ingredient purposely contaminated, for years knowing that it is contaminated. The following Sunday, I went to lunch, but I did not eat. I told my mother that my stomach was bad, and she looked at me weirdly, because I never reject grandmother's food. I watched the family eat. My father served himself 3 bowls of broth. As always, my Aunt Carmen had seconds. My cousins dipped red in the broth. My little nephews ate with their hands. My whole family was consuming something that I knew was harming them, and I was sitting there watching them with a fake smile. Grandmother looked at me from the head of the table. "My daughter, why are you not eating? Do you not like it?" "It is not that, grandmother. My stomach just hurts today." She looked at me a second longer than normal. It was just a second, but in that second, I saw something I had never noticed. Eyes evaluated me not with a grandmother's worry, but with something colder, as if she were verifying if I was telling the truth. "Well," she said, returning to her plate, "for next time I will prepare a little tea for you." After lunch, I waited for everyone to leave. I told my mother that I was staying to help grandmother clean. My mother was surprised because I never offered to stay, but she did not question it. When the house emptied out and it was just grandmother and I told her I was going to the bathroom. And instead of that, I went to the kitchen. Grandmother Consuelo's kitchen. The Forbidden Temple. It was smaller than I imagined. It had an old stove, copper pots hanging on the wall, a refrigerator with photos of grandchildren stuck on with magnets, and a large wooden cupboard with a glass door. Everything seemed normal, a grandmother's kitchen like any other. But I was not looking for normal. I opened the cupboard, normal spices, dried goods, beans, rice, flour, everything expected. But in the back, behind the large jars, there was a small dark glass jar without a label. I took it out, opened it, and smelled it. The smell was earthy, bitter, like wet dirt mixed with something metallic. I recognized it immediately. It was the compound from the broth. I opened the jar wider and looked inside. There was a fine dark brown powder. I took out my phone and took a photo of it. Then I took a small sample with my fingernail and transferred it to a tissue that I kept in my pocket. I put the jar exactly where it was and closed the cover. When I turned around, grandmother was standing in the kitchen doorway looking at me. The air turned solid. Grandmother Consuelo, 78 years old, was standing in the door frame with a dish towel in her hands, and an expression I had never seen on her before. It was not anger or surprise. It was the face of someone who has been waiting a long time for something to happen, and it finally happened. "What were you looking for?" "My daughter, a glass of water." "Grandmother." She looked at the cupboard that I had just closed. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at my hands. I saw that I had something in my right hand, because I closed it into a fist instinctively. She approached slowly, each step making the old wooden floor creak. She stopped in front of me and looked up at me, because I was a head taller than her. Her eyes were no longer the eyes of the grandmother who kisses foreheads and keeps drawings. They were the eyes of someone who has kept a secret for decades. And who knows that someone has just found it. "You are exactly like your grandfather," she told me, with a voice I did not recognize. Soft, but with a hidden edge. He also got involved where he was not called. He also asked questions that no one asked him to. "Grandmother, what are you talking about?" She grabbed my hand, the right one, the one with the closed fist. Her fingers were surprisingly strong for a woman of her age. She squeezed me until I opened my hand. She saw the tissue with the sample. Her expression did not change. She did not get scared. She did not get angry. She simply nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. She turned around and walked to the kitchen table. She sat down heavily and put her hands on the table, the same hands that had cooked for my family for over 40 years. "Sit down," she told me. "Grandmother, I need you to explain to me what is in that jar." "Sit down," she said with more firmness. "And I'm going to tell you why I do what I do. But first, you need to know something about your grandfather. Something that no one in this family knows except me. Something that changed everything 43 years ago." I sat down not because I wanted to, but because my legs would not hold me up. Grandmother looked at me with eyes that suddenly seemed tired, in a way that was not physical, but existential, eyes of someone who carries a weight so heavy that it has deformed her back from carrying it so much. "Your grandfather was not the man that everyone believes he was." She started. "Your grandfather did something to someone 43 years ago. Something that I discovered by accident, just like you discovered the jar. And when I confronted him, he told me that if I spoke, the same thing was going to happen to me." "The same thing as what, grandmother?" "He did what to whom?" Grandmother looked toward the kitchen window. It faced the backyard, the same yard, where my grandfather planted the walnut tree. That gives shade to the whole house, the tree under which we would sit as children to play, while he told us stories. She looked at me again. "My daughter, your grandfather killed my sister. He buried her in this yard and forced me to keep silent for 43 years. The broth that I cook for this family every Sunday is the only justice I have left." The crickets were chirping outside. The refrigerator hummed. And I was sitting in my grandmother's kitchen, processing that the man who told us stories under a walnut tree had a woman buried beneath that same tree, and that my grandmother had been taking her revenge, in silence for 40 years through a broth. The crickets were chirping outside. The refrigerator hummed. And I was sitting in my grandmother's kitchen processing that the man who told us stories under a walnut tree had a woman buried beneath that same tree, and that my grandmother had been taking her revenge in silence for 40 years through a broth. But he is dead, I whispered. My voice sounded paper-thin, barely breaking, through the dense, heavy air of the kitchen. Grandfather has been dead for 10 years. Why are you still doing this? Why Uncle Raphael? Why Aunt Carmen? Why my dad? Grandmother Consuelo did not blink. She did not cry. The hands resting on the table, the hands that had braided my hair and baked my birthday cakes, were perfectly steady. Because a tree with rotten roots does not produce healthy fruit, she said, smoothly. And because they helped him dig the hole. The blood drained from my face. My mind, usually a well-ordered filing cabinet of chemical structures, equations, and logic, simply stopped. What? They were boys, yes. 18, 19, 21. Her voice took on a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence, like a metronome ticking in a quiet room. But they were old enough. Your grandfather, Arturo, was a cruel man behind closed doors. You all knew him as the patriarch, the man who paid for your colleges, who carved the turkey. But he was a monster. My sister, Alba, came to live with us. When she lost her husband, she saw what Arturo did to me. The bruises, the broken ribs he told the doctor were from falling down the stairs. Alba tried to take me away one night. She packed our bags. But he caught us. Grandmother's eyes drifted toward the dark window. He struck her with the heavy iron fire poker. She didn't die immediately. She was bleeding, crying on the living room rug. I was screaming. And then your father and your uncles came downstairs. I clamped a hand over my mouth. They saw her. Grandmother continued, her tone chillingly detached. They saw me begging for them to call an ambulance. But Arturo told them that if she lived, he would go to prison, the family business would collapse, and they would have nothing. No inheritance, no future. He told them to choose. She leaned forward, and for the first time, I saw the absolute abyss of hatred in her eyes. Your father, the man who bought you your first bicycle, went out to the shed and brought back the shovels. Your uncle Raphael held the flashlight. Your Aunt Carmen, who was only 16, mopped the blood off the hardwood floor. They buried my sister alive, Clara. She was still breathing when they threw the dirt over her face. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the edges of the wooden table to keep from falling out of my chair. They thought I would leave, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. But where could a woman with no money, no education, and 3 complicit children go? In 1983? To the police? The police chief played poker with your grandfather. Every Friday. No. I stayed. I smiled. I made their beds. I washed the clothes they wore to bury my sister. And I started reading about mushrooms. She pointed to the cupboard. I couldn't just poison them quickly. Arsenic, cyanide, those invite autopsies, police investigations. I would have been arrested, and Alba would have been forgotten under the tree forever. I needed something invisible, something that mimicked the natural decay of life. I learned to cultivate Aspergillus acraceus on damp grains in the basement. I extracted the ochratoxin. I calculated the dosages. A few milligrams every Sunday. Not enough to kill them instantly, but enough to slowly, irreparably, destroy their kidneys, their livers, their nervous systems. I choked on the word. You turn their bodies into ticking clocks. I gave them exactly what they gave my sister, she said. A slow, suffocating end. Your grandfather went first because I gave him the highest doses. Then I moved on to your uncles, your father. But my cousins, I cried out, the shock finally giving way to desperate anger. My little nephews, they eat the broth, grandmother. They didn't bury Alba. They weren't even born. For a fraction of a second, a shadow crossed her face. A flicker of something that looked like regret, rapidly buried under decades of calcified bitterness. Collateral damage, she said coldly. The rot is in their blood, Clara. The blood of cowards and murderers. I cannot stop the process. If I stop, they live. If I stop, I betray Alba. You are poisoning innocent children, I said, my voice trembling. I stood up. The kitchen felt like a cage. You are just as much a monster as he was. Grandmother Consuelo slowly stood up as well. She picked up the dish towel and folded it meticulously. You're a scientist, Clara. You look at the world through a microscope. You think in terms of right and wrong, poison and cure. But when you live in a house built on bones, there is no cure. Only demolition. She looked at me, her gaze piercing right through my chest. You have the tissue. With the sample. You have the laboratory equipment. You can go to the police. You can send an old woman to die in a prison hospital. But remember this, if you expose me, you expose them. The police will dig up the yard. They will find the fractured skull. They will interrogate your father, your uncles, your aunt. They will all go to prison for accessory to murder. The family name will be destroyed. Your cousins will grow up visiting their parents through bulletproof glass. She walked past me, stopping briefly at the threshold. The choice is yours, Clara. You can be the one to finally tear this family apart. Or you can sit down next Sunday and eat your broth. I did not sleep for 3 days. I went to my job at the pharmaceutical lab, mechanically running mass spectrometry tests on synthetic compounds, but my mind was trapped in an endless loop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father holding a shovel in the dark. I saw my Aunt Carmen scrubbing blood off the floorboards. I saw the children, my little nephews, dipping their bread into a bowl laced with a microscopic death sentence. I was a chemist. I understood entropy, the inevitable decline of an ordered system into chaos. My family was a system, and my grandmother had introduced a catalyst that was slowly tearing the molecular bonds apart. By Wednesday night, the cognitive dissonance became unbearable. I needed empirical data. I needed to know if the story was true, or if my grandmother was a deeply disturbed woman hallucinating a trauma to justify her psychosis. At 2 a.m., dressed in dark clothes, I parked my car 2 blocks away from my grandmother's house. I knew she took sleeping pills, ironically prescribed by the same doctor who treated my father's headaches. The house was pitch black, a massive Victorian shadow looming against the suburban sky. I bypassed the creaky wooden gate and slipped into the backyard. The walnut tree stood at the center, its massive branches spreading out like skeletal fingers. Against the moonlight, I went to the old gardening shed. The padlock was the same combination it had been since I was 10, 1-9-8-3, 1983. The year Alba died. A sickening shiver ran down my spine. I took a heavy iron shovel and walked to the base of the tree. The ground was hard, packed down by 40 years of family barbecues, children running, and seasons changing. I picked a spot between the thickest roots and drove the spade into the earth. I dug for 2 hours. My hands blistered. Sweat stung my eyes. I felt like a grave robber, a traitor, a ghost hunting another ghost. At 3 feet deep, the shovel hit something that did not sound like a rock. It was a dull, hollow thud. I dropped the shovel and fell to my knees. Using my hands, I frantically scraped away the damp soil. My fingers brushed against something thick and plastic. A heavy-duty tarp, miraculously intact after decades, though brittle at the edges. I pulled at it, ripping the plastic. A terrible, sweet and sour smell of old earth and trapped decay wafted up. I turned on my small penlight. Nestled in the rotting fabric of what used to be a floral dress were bones. The pale, unmistakable curve of a human ribcage. And higher up, resting against a thick tree root, was a skull. The left side of the cranium was caved in, fractured into a spiderweb of shattered bone. Beside the skeletal hand lay a tarnished silver locket. I reached down, my hands trembling violently, and picked it up. I pried it open with a dirt-caked thumbnail. Inside was a tiny, faded black and white photograph of 2 smiling girls, my grandmother Consuelo, and a woman who looked exactly like her, Alba. I sat back in the dirt, gasping for air as tears finally broke through my shock. It was true. All of it. My father. My uncles. They were monsters wearing the masks of family men. And we, the grandchildren, were the oblivious audience to their lifelong masquerade. I buried the tarp again. I packed the dirt down perfectly, scattering dry leaves over the top to hide the disturbed earth. I cleaned the shovel, locked the shed, and walked back to my car. As I sat behind the wheel, staring at the silver locket in my palm, my grief began to crystallize into something else. Something cold. Something clinical. I could not go to the police. Grandmother was right. The media circus, the trials, the absolute destruction of my cousins' lives, the innocent ones who knew nothing, it would be a second massacre. But I could not let her continue to poison the children. I could not let the ochratoxin keep flowing. The equation was unbalanced. I needed to balance it. On Thursday afternoon, I called my father. Dad, can you meet me? Just you and me. At the old diner by the highway. He sounded surprised but happy. Of course, Clara Bear. Everything okay? Just missing you. I lied smoothly. I realized, with a pang of dread, how easily the deception came to me. I shared their DNA, after all. He arrived looking tired. The chronic headaches had left deep grooves around his eyes. His skin had a faint, sickly pallor, the hallmark of renal strain. As he sat across from me, ordering a black coffee, I felt a violent tug-of-war in my chest. This was the man who had stayed up with me when I had a fever, who had paid my tuition, and who had buried a woman alive. "You look exhausted, Dad," I said softly. Work, stress, getting old," he chuckled, rubbing his temples. I reached into my pocket and placed the silver locket on the Formica table, right next to his coffee cup. My father's eyes dropped to the locket. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. All the color instantly vanished from his face. His jaw went slack, and his hands began to shake so violently that his coffee spilled over the rim of the cup. "Where?" he rasped, his voice suddenly sounding like a terrified child's. "Where did you get that?" "Under the walnut tree," I said, my voice deadpan. I dug 3 feet down, between the roots. He covered his mouth with his hands, emitting a low, pathetic whimper. He looked around the diner in sheer panic, but no one was paying attention to us. Clara, you don't understand," he babbled, tears immediately springing to his eyes. "You don't know what he was like. He was a demon. He had a gun. He said he would shoot us all. We were just kids." "You were 21, Dad." I was terrified, he hissed, leaning in, weeping openly now. "He said if we didn't help him, he would kill your grandmother next. We did it to save her. We protected our mother." I stared at him. The sheer, tragic irony of it all felt like a physical blow. "You thought you were saving her?" "Yes." We never spoke of it again. We suffered in silence. For her. "And did you ever think," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "what it did to her? Living in that house? Cooking for the boys who buried her sister? Did you ever wonder why grandfather's organs failed? Why your kidneys are failing? Why Uncle Raphael collapses?" My father froze. His tear-filled eyes widened as my words slowly penetrated his. Panic. What are you saying?" "I am a chemist, Dad. I tested the Sunday broth." I watched the realization hit him. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. He slumped back in the booth, his hands sliding off the table. The horror of what his mother had been doing to him, what he had forced her to become, by his complicity, shattered whatever was left of his reality. "She knows," he whispered, staring at his trembling hands. "She's been punishing us. She's poisoning everyone," I corrected, "including your grandchildren, because she thinks the rot is in the blood." "Oh God," he sobbed quietly. "Oh God, we deserve it. We deserve it all." "No," I said firmly. "You might, but the kids don't, and I won't let them die." I leaned forward, grabbing his wrist. "Listen to me very carefully. You are going to go to Uncle Raphael and Aunt Carmen. You're going to tell them that I know. But you're not going to say a word to grandmother. You will continue to go to Sunday dinner. You will act completely normal. Clara, we can't. She's killing us." "I am handling the toxin," I said, my voice adopting the absolute authority of a lab director. "If you run or if you go to the police, she goes down and she takes you all with her. You will go to prison for Alba's murder. So you will do exactly as I say. Do you understand?" He nodded weakly, a broken man. I left him crying in the booth. I had no tears left for him. The father I knew had died the moment I opened that locket. All that remained was a variable in my equation. Friday night. The laboratory was empty. I stood in front of the fume hood, wearing my white coat, goggles, and nitrile gloves. I had spent the last 48 hours researching Aspergillus acraceus and its exact flavor profile. Grandmother's genius was in the earthy, slightly metallic bitterness of the fungal powder, which blended perfectly with the rich, heavy spices of her Sunday broth. If I simply stole the jar, she would notice. If I replaced it with something that tasted different, she would know immediately and cultivate a new batch, hiding it somewhere I could never find. I needed a perfect molecular decoy. I created a blend of dried porcini mushroom powder, roasted chicory root, and a microscopic trace of ferrous sulfate to mimic the metallic tang. I ground it down in a mortar and pestle until the micron size matched the photo I had taken of her toxin. It smelled identical: damp earth, bitter umami, old secrets. But It was completely, biologically inert. On Saturday afternoon, while grandmother was taking her mandatory nap, I let myself into the house using my spare key. I slipped into the kitchen. The forbidden temple. I opened the cupboard, reached behind the large jars, and pulled out the dark glass jar. I swapped the toxic powder for my decoy, packing it down exactly as she had it. I took the real ochratoxin, sealed it in a specialized biohazard container in my bag, and closed the cupboard. The immediate danger was neutralized. The family would eat the broth tomorrow, and it would just be soup. The kids would be safe. But as I stood in the center of the kitchen, looking at the copper pots and the old stove, I realized something dark and fundamental. Neutralizing the poison didn't fix the family. It didn't bring Alba back. It just allowed my father and my uncles to get away with murder forever. They would go back to their lives, relieved. They would continue to smile in family photos. They would hug their grandchildren with the same hands that had shoveled dirt onto a living woman's face. Grandmother Consuelo's execution was flawed because it lacked precision. She let anger blind her, targeting the innocent alongside the guilty. But her underlying hypothesis? That the rot needed to be eradicated? As I stared at my reflection in the dark glass of the oven door, I realized with terrifying clarity that she wasn't wrong. Science demands purity. If a sample is contaminated, you don't just leave it. You isolate the contaminant. You eradicate it. Otherwise, it spreads. My father, my uncle, my aunt, they were the contaminants. They had introduced deceit, cowardice, and murder into our bloodline. I opened my bag and looked at the biohazard container, holding the lethal dose of ochratoxin. Then, I looked at the vials I had brought from my own lab. Vials containing a synthesized, highly concentrated, fast-acting, untraceable cardiac arrest agent, a compound I had been developing for pharmaceutical testing. Odorless, tasteless, fatal within hours, mimicking a massive, sudden myocardial infarction. I didn't need 40 years. I only needed one Sunday. Sunday arrived with a bright, mocking sunshine. The house was loud, as it always was. My cousins were arguing over a football game on the television. The little nephews were running through the halls with plastic dinosaurs. I walked into the dining room. My father, Uncle Raphael, and Aunt Carmen were standing in the corner. When they saw me, they stiffened. They looked like ghosts. Their eyes were hollow, shifting nervously toward the kitchen door. They knew what was in the broth. They knew they had to eat it or risk the collapse of the entire family facade. Dinner is ready. Grandmother Consuelo's voice rang out from the kitchen. The family swarmed the massive wooden table. I took my usual seat. Grandmother sat at the head of the table. She looked at me, a silent question in her eyes. I gave her a small, imperceptible nod. A lie to comfort her. I am keeping your secret. She smiled, a genuine, chilling smile, and began to pass the large porcelain tureen of dark, fragrant broth. Eat up, my loves, she said. Eat up. My father took his bowl with trembling hands. Uncle Raphael was sweating profusely. Aunt Carmen looked like she was about to faint. But as the younger generations, the cousins, the kids, began to eat eagerly, the three siblings had no choice. They lifted their spoons. They swallowed. I watched them closely. They tasted the earthy, bitter flavor. They swallowed. Their fear, believing they were ingesting the slow death they deserved. They didn't know I had replaced grandmother's powder in the kitchen. They also didn't know that 30 minutes before dinner, while grandmother was setting the table, I had slipped into the dining room. I hadn't poisoned the main tureen. That would harm the innocent. Instead, I had applied my synthesized cardiac compound directly to the rims of 3 specific bowls. The bowls placed at my father's, my uncle's, and my aunt's designated seats. I took a spoonful of my own, safe broth. It tasted wonderful, rich, deep, and comforting. Grandmother watched the family eat, a look of profound, tragic satisfaction on her wrinkled face. She believed her justice was continuing. She believed the slow decay was moving forward. This is delicious, grandmother, I said, looking her directly in the eyes. Thank you, Clara, she replied softly. It is a very old recipe. I think, I said, smiling faintly as I watched my father wipe a bead of sweat from his pale forehead. I would like to learn it. I think it's time I started helping you in the kitchen. Grandmother paused. The kitchen was her temple. No one entered, but she looked at me, truly looked at me, and saw the absolute, unflinching coldness in my eyes. She saw the chemist. She saw the heir to her vengeance. She smiled, and the tension in her ancient shoulders finally seemed to relax. "I would like that very much, my daughter," she said. "Next Sunday you will cook with me." The meal continued. The laughter echoed off the walls. Outside, the walnut tree cast a long, dark shadow over the grass. By midnight, the ambulances would arrive at 3 different houses. The paramedics would pronounce massive, simultaneous heart attacks. The doctors would call it a tragic, unexplained genetic anomaly. And next Sunday, the broth would be completely clean, the rot would be gone, and I would be the one holding the spoon.